Somewhere in the corner of southwestern Europe, tucked between the Bay of Biscay and the high ridgelines of the Pyrenees, there is a people who have been asking a question for longer than most civilizations have existed. Not asking it out loud necessarily, just living it, carrying it in their mouths every time they speak. Because the language that echoes through those mountain valleys, through the fishing towns along the Atlantic coast, through the markets and the kitchens and the songs passed from grandparents to grandchildren, that language does not belong to the family that covers almost everything else on this continent. It is not related to French, not to Spanish, not to Latin or Greek or Russian or Hindi, or any of the thousands of languages that trace their roots back to a single ancestral tongue that swept across Eurasia thousands of years ago. It stands alone, and that is one of the strangest facts in the entire history of Europe. Before we go any further, if you're settling in right now, getting comfortable, letting the day go quiet around you, I want to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. It genuinely means something to look through them and find Berlin at breakfast and Buenos Aires at midnight and someone in Melbourne who can't sleep on a Tuesday. You're all there, all at once, and that never gets old. And if you want to listen without ads and without background music, just the voice and the story, you can follow the channel on Spotify. The link is in the description, and it helps keep this going more than you might think. Now, back to those mountains. The Basque country sits at a crossroads that geography seems to have designed on purpose. To the north, the Atlantic. To the east and south, the Pyrenees rising like a wall between the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of continental Europe. For tens of thousands of years, people moved through this region, following coastlines, crossing passes, retreating from glaciers, returning when the ice pulled back. It was never truly isolated. It was something more interesting than isolated. It was a place where roots converged and populations pressed against each other, where the mountains offered shelter without offering escape from the world entirely. A refuge, yes, but a porous one. A crossroads that occasionally became a dead end, and occasionally became a cradle. What survives there today is a puzzle assembled from at least 3 different kinds of evidence, and none of them, on their own, give you the full picture. Archaeology can tell you who was living where and when, what tools they used, how they buried their dead, whether they kept animals or grew grain. Linguistics can map the deep structure of a language, trace borrowings and changes, identify what is ancient and what arrived from elsewhere. And ancient DNA, extracted from bones that have been in the ground for thousands of years, can tell you something about the people themselves, where their ancestors came from, how populations moved and mixed and replaced each other over time. Put all 3 together and you start to see something. Not an answer exactly. More like the shape of a very old question coming slowly into focus. Here is the basic outline of the mystery. Europe today is dominated linguistically by Indo-European languages. That family includes almost everything spoken from Ireland to Bangladesh, from Scandinavia to Sri Lanka. It is one of the most successful language families in human history, and the leading explanation for how it spread across Europe involves massive migrations of people from the Eurasian steppe, roughly 5,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. Those migrations were real. The genetic and archaeological evidence for them is substantial. They changed Europe in ways that are still visible today, in the DNA of living Europeans, in the structure of their languages, in the cultures that followed. But Basque survived, and the question of how and why it survived, while every neighbouring language was eventually absorbed or replaced, is one that researchers have been circling for well over a century. The answers that have been proposed range from the careful and well-supported to the dramatic and deeply misleading. Some people have used the Basque language and the Basque people as evidence for ideas about racial purity, about unchanged Paleolithic survivors, about a people somehow untouched by history. Those ideas are not supported by the evidence. They never were. The actual story is more complicated, more interesting, and ultimately more human than any myth of pristine origins could ever be. What the evidence does suggest, and we'll follow it carefully through everything that comes next, is that the survival of the Basque language is not the story of a population that never changed. It is a story about geography and timing and the way that language and ancestry can move through history on completely different tracks. People mix, populations absorb and are absorbed, but sometimes a language holds on even when the people speaking it are themselves a blend of many different histories. Sometimes it is the mountains that matter, sometimes it is the sea, sometimes it is something harder to name, something in the way a community decides, generation after generation, that this is still who we are. Over the next while, we are going to follow the clues. We will go back to a Europe before the Indo-Europeans arrived, when the continent was home to farmers and hunters whose languages we mostly cannot reconstruct, whose lives we can only partially glimpse through the things they left in the earth. We will watch the steppe expansions unfold and trace what happened in Iberia specifically, because Iberia's Bronze Age story has its own strange wrinkles that matter enormously here. We will look at what the ancient DNA studies actually say, and what they do not say, about Basque ancestry, and we will try to hold the whole picture, the contradictions and the uncertainties and the genuinely astonishing parts, without forcing it into a shape it does not naturally take. This is not a story with a clean ending, but it is one of the most quietly remarkable stories Europe has to tell, and it starts, as so many things do, with a language that refuses to be explained away. Imagine a map of Europe from 6,000 years ago, not the Europe we know, with its borders and nations and familiar language families spreading across the continent like a colour-coded diagram, something older, something we can only partially reconstruct, and only then by reading the faint traces left in place names, in borrowed words, in the occasional inscription scratched onto stone in an alphabet that doesn't quite match any language we recognise. A map full of sounds we will never hear spoken aloud, tongues that rose and fell and disappeared without leaving enough behind to tell us what they were. That is the honest picture of pre-Indo-European Europe. Not a blank exactly, but close to one. We know there were languages, many of them, spoken by hunters who'd been in Europe for tens of thousands of years, then by the farmers who arrived from Anatolia around 9,000 years ago, then by the various populations who followed, mixing and settling and spreading into new territories as the climate shifted and the forests changed and the animals moved. All of those people had languages. All of those languages left the continent. Most of them left almost nothing else behind. A handful survive as faint impressions in the historical record. Iberian, spoken in the eastern and southeastern parts of the peninsula before Latin swallowed it whole, is attested in inscriptions, but we cannot fully translate it, cannot trace its relatives, cannot be certain where it came from. Tartessian, from the far south of Iberia, is even more fragmentary. Pictish in Scotland, Etruscan in what is now Tuscany, which survived long enough to leave substantial written records and still resist complete interpretation, Minoan on Crete, the language of the Indus Valley civilization, which we can read in its script and cannot understand at all. These are the visible remnants, and even they are mostly shadows. For every language that made it into an inscription, there were dozens, probably hundreds, that ended before writing arrived, before anyone thought to carve their words into something that would last. Before we go any further, it is worth being precise about one term, because it gets misunderstood constantly in ways that matter a great deal to this story. When researchers talk about Indo-European, they are talking about a language family, a group of languages that share common ancestry, that descended from a single ancestral tongue spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe thousands of years ago, and that spread through migration and contact and cultural dominance to cover an enormous portion of the world. Indo-European is not a biological category. It is not a race, not a bloodline, not a genetic population. The people who spoke Proto-Indo-European were a real group with a traceable genetic signature, and the expansions that carried their languages across Eurasia were real demographic events with real genetic consequences. But language and ancestry are not the same thing, and they do not always move together. You can carry the genes of one population and the language of another. History is full of exactly that. The deep timeline of Europe before those expansions is easier to sketch in broad strokes than to fill in with detail. The Paleolithic, the deep old Stone Age, belongs to hunter-gatherers who had been living across the continent for tens of thousands of years. They left tools and bones and cave paintings of astonishing sophistication, and almost nothing else we can interpret with confidence. Then, beginning around 11,000 years ago, as the ice retreated and the climate warmed, Europe entered the Mesolithic, a transitional period of smaller, more mobile groups adapting to forests that were rapidly changing shape. And then, moving out of Anatolia and across the Mediterranean and into the continent from the southeast, came farmers, people who kept animals and grew grain and built settlements that stayed in one place. They carried a different genetic signature from the hunter-gatherers already in Europe, and they carried, almost certainly, their own languages, none of which we can recover. What followed was not a clean replacement. It was something messier and more gradual, the kind of layered process that is easy to describe and hard to imagine. Hunter-gatherers didn't simply vanish when farmers arrived. They mixed and retreated and mixed again, and in some regions persisted in recognizable form for thousands of years after farming had taken hold nearby. The Neolithic, that age of early farming, is itself not a single moment but a long, uneven process, different in different parts of Europe, moving at different speeds, meeting different levels of resistance or absorption, depending on the local landscape and the populations already there. And then the Bronze Age arrived, and with it something that would reshape the continent more dramatically than anything since the end of the ice. But why do the languages disappear? It is worth sitting with that question for a moment, because it is easy to assume that language must persist if people persist, that as long as someone is speaking a tongue it will survive. History suggests otherwise. Languages vanish through replacement. When a new population arrives in sufficient numbers to make its language dominant, and the older tongue loses its speakers generation by generation. They vanish through assimilation when communities adopt the prestige language of a larger or more powerful group, not because they are forced to at sword point, but because it is useful, because it opens trade routes and political relationships and social mobility. They vanish through elite dominance when the people who control resources and status speak one language and everyone below them gradually converges on it. They vanish through demographic change when populations shift fast enough that continuity breaks down and the next generation grows up in a different linguistic world than their grandparents. All of these mechanisms were operating in pre-Indo-European Europe, and then the steppe expansions accelerated all of them at once. The genetic and archaeological record shows that the people who spread westward from the Pontic steppe during the Bronze Age carried not just a distinctive ancestry, but a way of life, a technology of herding and horses and wheeled transport, a social organization that was in many respects more mobile and in some respects more hierarchical than what it encountered. Their languages spread with them and eventually became the substrate for nearly everything spoken on the continent today. The older languages, the farmers' languages, the hunters' languages, the languages that had been there before any of this, they were not left behind. They were absorbed, borrowed from, stripped of speakers, and eventually silenced. And then there is Basque, sitting there in the Western Pyrenees, still spoken by hundreds of thousands of people, still entirely without a known relative anywhere in the world. The question of why Basque survived when its neighbours did not does not have a single answer, and anyone offering one confidently should be approached with some scepticism. But the question is not unanswerable either. It is a question about how language, ancestry, geography and time interact, about what it takes for a tongue to hold on when all the forces of history are pushing against it. And to begin working toward any answer at all, we need to understand what Basque actually is, how deeply strange it looks when you set it beside everything around it, and what that strangeness might tell us about how old it is and where it might have come from. Because the language itself is a kind of evidence, the most unusual, most contested, most fascinating piece of evidence we have, and it has been sitting there on the edge of Europe, in the mouths of people who fish the Atlantic and farm the mountain valleys, waiting patiently to be understood, for longer than most of the questions we are still trying to answer about it have even been asked. So, what is Basque, or Euskara, in the technical sense? In modern linguistics, when researchers say that Basque is a language isolate, they mean something very specific and also very limited. It does not mean mysterious or alien or older than everything else. It simply means that so far no one has been able to demonstrate that Basque belongs to any known language family. It has no proven sisters, no confirmed cousins, no documented ancestor beyond what we can infer from its own older stages. Indo-European is a family. You can line up Latin, Sanskrit, Ancient Greek, Old Irish, Gothic, Hittite, and see regular patterns, consonants shifting in predictable ways, word endings matching across thousands of miles, core vocabulary that maps onto shared roots with mathematical neatness. From that you can reconstruct a hypothetical ancestor, Proto-Indo-European, and test your reconstruction again and again against new data. With Basque, when you try to do that with any other known language, the patterns do not line up in a way that satisfies the usual standards. There are similarities here and there, resemblances of sound and meaning that invite comparison, but they do not settle into the kind of system that linguists look for when declaring a family relationship. So Basque stands alone, at least for now. That is all language isolate really means. Alone in our current map of language families, not necessarily alone in history. This is where it helps to be clear about what linguists can and cannot do when they look deep into the past. When two languages are clearly related, the evidence tends to shout. You can trace changes in sound over time, like the famous shift that turned Indo-European P into F in the Germanic branch, giving us Latin pater but English father. You can follow entire sets of words migrating together, numbers, kinship terms, parts of the body, basic verbs like to be and to carry. These correspondences are regular, repeated and resistant to coincidence. They let researchers say with considerable confidence that languages X and Y share a common ancestor. But as you go farther back in time, the signal decays. Sound changes pile on top of one another. Words are replaced, borrowed, lost. Grammar reorganizes itself. After a certain number of millennia, it becomes extremely hard to tell whether two languages are related or just happen to look vaguely similar, because there are only so many short, simple sounds that humans like to use. This is why most historical linguists are cautious about claims that reach beyond, say, 6,000 to 8,000 years with strong certainty. They don't say deeper relationships are impossible. They say that past a point, the tools we have stop giving clearly testable answers. The data thins out faster than the imagination does. Basque sits right in that twilight zone, old enough that any original relatives might have changed beyond recognition, or vanished entirely without leaving a written trace. Isolated enough that it is tempting to see echoes of it everywhere, especially in other mysterious or poorly understood languages. Over the past century and more, people have proposed all kinds of deep connections. There are hypotheses linking Basque to the ancient Iberian language attested on the eastern side of the peninsula. Others try to tie it to the languages of the Caucasus, because those are also famous for complex sound systems and long strings of consonants. Some have suggested remote ties to Afro-Asiatic languages like Berber or ancient Egyptian, or to wide speculative macro-families that would unite half of Eurasia in a single deep ancestry. These ideas are not all equally careful, and some drift quickly into wishful thinking. But even the more serious attempts run into the same brick wall: lack of clean, systematic evidence that can persuade a skeptical specialist. You can always find words that look a bit alike if you search far enough. What matters are regular, repeated correspondences across core vocabulary and grammar, and robust methods for ruling out chance or borrowing. So far, none of the proposed deep relationships for Basque has convinced a majority of experts. That does not mean Basque is fundamentally unrelated to everything else on Earth. Every human language ultimately goes back, through an unimaginably long chain of ancestors and cousins, to the first flexible systems of speech our species developed. It means only that we cannot currently trace Basque's branch of that family tree beyond a certain point. The trail fades. The connections, if they exist, lie beyond the resolution of our instruments. There is, however, one relationship that looks much less speculative, because it does not require us to reach impossibly far back. That is the connection to Aquitanian. In what is now southwestern France and the northern side of the Pyrenees, the Romans encountered peoples they called Aquitani. They left behind inscriptions, often in Latin letters, that record personal names and the names of local deities. When linguists look at those names, some of them light up with familiar shapes, elements like -soon, -naro, -enes, and others appear both in Aquitanian inscriptions and in historical Basque. Divine names resemble Basque words. Personal names break down into pieces that look like Basque roots. It is not a perfect one-to-one match, and we do not have long texts, but the overlap is strong enough that many specialists treat Aquitanian not as a random neighbouring language, but as a close relative of Basque, possibly an earlier stage or a sister branch. If that interpretation is right, it suggests something important. It hints that Basque, or something very much like it, was spoken not only in the modern Basque country, but across a wider zone straddling the Pyrenees during the Roman period. That does not tell us how far back its deeper roots go. It does not prove Paleolithic continuity, but it anchors Basque-type speech in that region at least 2,000 years ago, and likely earlier, in a way that lines up with what we see in the archaeology. A distinctive cultural corridor along the mountains, never quite absorbed in the same way as the plains to the north and south. Beyond inscriptions, there is another kind of evidence that often gets called on in these debates: names that stick to the land itself. Place names and river names are stubborn things. You can conquer a region, change its official language, reshape its political structures, and still keep drinking from a river whose name comes from a language nobody has spoken as a mother tongue for 1,000 years. Hydronyms, the names of rivers and streams, are especially conservative. They get borrowed from one language into another almost unchanged, generation after generation. Across Europe, linguists have tried to peel back these layers. Some river names clearly come from Celtic, or from early Germanic, or from Latin. Others seem older, with roots that do not fit neatly into any known family. In the Western Pyrenees and surrounding areas, a cluster of place names and old river names shows patterns that look Basque-like or Aquitanian-like. Certain endings, certain sound combinations, certain recurring elements that still make sense if you know Euskara. This does not mean that every such name is Basque in origin, or that you can read a complete prehistoric map from place names alone. Borrowing, reshaping, and chance resemblance all happen. A later language can retrofit an older name so that it seems meaningful in its own vocabulary, masking the original. but taken in aggregate, these stubborn names suggest that a Basque-related language layer once extended beyond the tight boundaries of the modern Basque country. They offer hints rather than answers. The land remembers fragments, syllables, echoes that we can sometimes match to the living language, sometimes only suspect. They help outline a zone of historical presence, but they do not by themselves tell us when that presence began, or what exactly the language sounded like 5,000 years ago. So when we say Euskara is different, we are talking about this combination of solitude and faint company. A language with no proven global relatives, but with a traceable local cousin in Aquitanian. A tongue whose deeper ancestry disappears into the mists of prehistory, but whose footprints appear in old inscriptions and in the names of rivers and valleys. Its uniqueness is real, but it is not the uniqueness of an unchanging fossil. It is the uniqueness of a survivor whose family album is mostly missing, with only a few blurred photographs left at the edges. To go any further, we have to bring in other kinds of evidence. The story of ice sheets and refuges, of hunter-gatherers, early farmers, and later Bronze Age migrations. Because if the language hints at an old, local continuity in the Western Pyrenees, the landscape and the DNA might help us understand how that continuity managed to hold on when so many others were swept away. To see where that story might begin, we have to zoom the map out and wind the clock back, far beyond Romans and Celts, and even farmers with polished stone axes, back into a Europe that would feel almost like another planet. In the late Ice Age, Western Europe was not a frozen block of white, but a restless system. Glaciers advanced and retreated like slow, grinding tides. Temperatures swung up and down over just a few thousand years. What had been open grassland could turn to patchy woodland, and then back again within the span of many human lifetimes. Sea levels were lower, coastlines were farther out. The Bay of Biscay reached deeper into a broad, cold plain. Rivers we know today, Garonne, Ebro, Adour, cut their paths across a landscape that would be hard for us to recognize. For people living then, nothing about the environment was guaranteed. A valley rich in game might, over a few generations, become a sparse, windy steppe. A shoreline full of shellfish might drown as ice sheets melted and the sea crept inland. Habitats shifted, animal ranges moved, plant communities reshuffled. The map of resources was constantly redrawn. Yet, in this flickering world, some regions seem to have been more forgiving than others. This is where the idea of refugia comes in, a concept borrowed from ecology and applied cautiously to humans. A refugium, in the classic sense, is a place that stays relatively habitable when the wider region becomes harsh. During the coldest phases, when ice pressed south and much of Europe became bitter, dry steppe, certain pockets remained milder, or at least more predictable. Sheltered river valleys, coastal zones buffered by the ocean, mountain flanks with a variety of microclimates packed close together. Plants and animals could ride out the worst conditions there, persisting in small, fragmented populations while disappearing from the broader landscape. When the ice retreated and climates eased, these refuges became launch pads. Species expanded outward again from these pockets, recolonizing areas they had abandoned thousands of years before. Over the last few decades, archaeologists and paleoclimatologists have suggested that human groups may have done something similar, not in the sense of a single closed shelter full of the Basques waiting out the Ice Age, but as a patchwork of livable zones where different bands could persist while conditions elsewhere deteriorated. The Iberian Peninsula, and especially its northern edge and the lands just to the north in what's now southwest France, has often been proposed as one of these human refugia. Caves in Cantabria, in the Basque country, in the Perigord and the Pyrenean foothills hold some of the most continuous sequences of human occupation in Europe, stretching back tens of thousands of years. Layers of sediment and ash and discarded tools pile up, one atop another, like the pages of a very long, very incomplete diary. When researchers read that diary, they see both continuity and change. The stone tools of the people who painted at Altamira and Lascaux, the so-called Magdalenian culture of the late glacial period, show clear links across a broad swathe of Western Europe. You find similar tool types, similar ways of working bone and antler, similar artistic motifs, from the Cantabrian coast to the Dordogne. This suggests that, even in a fractured Ice Age landscape, ideas and objects travelled long distances. But in the layers below and above, in the transition from earlier cultures like the Solutrean, and then forward into the Mesolithic after the ice sheets retreated, the story becomes more local. Certain valleys and regions show their own flavours of tool-making, their own ways of shaping microliths, their own patterns of site use. In Iberia and southwest France, there are stretches where the archaeological record looks surprisingly dense and continuous compared to some areas farther north and east, which seem to empty and refill as climates swing. This is one strand of evidence behind the refuge picture. Not a single, unbroken people, but a region that remained attractive, or at least survivable during climatic downturns, and that kept being reoccupied and reused as conditions changed. It can be tempting, at this point, to slide from tools to tongues, to say, if the stone artifacts show local continuity in the Western Pyrenees and nearby areas, maybe the languages did too. Maybe some deep ancestor of Basque was already there, holding on in the same valleys where people had been camping and hunting for thousands of years. The refuge idea is appealing partly because it offers a tidy story. Harsh climate pushes populations into safer pockets. Those pockets foster long, overlapping histories. Later, when new waves of people and languages move through Europe, the old refuge-based traditions have a head start in those familiar landscapes. They have deep local knowledge, dense social networks, pathways worn into the mountains. They might be harder to dislodge. But we have to move carefully here. Archaeology by itself does not give us languages. A particular stone tool style does not speak Basque or Celtic or anything else. The same technology can be used by speakers of different languages. Different cultures can converge on similar tools because they face similar problems. Continuity in the way people knap flint or carve antler does not automatically mean continuity in what they call themselves, whom they marry, or what sounds they use to count their children. The same is true for ancestry. Surviving in a region through the Ice Age does not mean staying genetically unchanged, or untouched, or pure. Even in refugia, people would have moved, married, merged, and replaced one another over time. A valley that shows Paleolithic occupation, then Mesolithic, then Neolithic, then Bronze Age, is not guaranteeing that one unbroken lineage ran through all those layers. It is telling us that the valley kept drawing human groups back, again and again, under different climatic and cultural regimes. So when researchers speak of the Iberian and southwest French refugia, especially in relation to Basque, they are usually doing something more modest than claiming a frozen Paleolithic lineage. They are pointing out that this corner of Europe seems to have been a long-term hotspot of human presence, even as the climate swung wildly. They are suggesting that, in such places, certain cultural patterns and perhaps certain languages might have had a better chance of persisting, of adapting locally rather than being completely erased. In other words, refugia do not give us direct proof that a Basque-like language was spoken under Ice Age glaciers, but they do offer a plausible ecological backdrop for why, many millennia later, when Indo-European languages spread across much of Europe, something different might still have been whispering in the valleys of the Western Pyrenees. To move from possibility to something firmer, though, we need the other half of the picture, the actual movements of people that we can detect in their DNA, layered over the archaeology of tools and bones. And that story really begins when the ice has melted back, the forests thicken, and new kinds of communities arrive with seeds in their hands. When we say farmers arrive, it's easy to picture a single moment. One day the peninsula is forests and scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. The next, a neat line of migrants appears at the Pyrenees, leading goats and oxen carrying sacks of grain, ready to replace whatever came before. The reality looks slower, more tangled, and, in many places, more like a long conversation than a conquest. By the time farming reached Iberia, it had already been moving across Europe for thousands of years. Its ultimate roots lay to the east, in the Neolithic communities of Anatolia and the Near East, where people had first begun to domesticate wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and cattle. As those practices spread west, they didn't simply leap from one end of the continent to the other. They moved in steps, through many different hands and many different landscapes. Archaeologists and geneticists now see multiple routes by which this new way of life entered the peninsula. One path hugged the Mediterranean, island hopping and skirting coasts from the Aegean through Italy and southern France, eventually reaching what is now Catalonia and Valencia. Another seems to have followed more inland rivers and corridors, filtering across the Pyrenees and down from the lands of present-day southern France into the Ebro basin and the Atlantic facade. At each step, the picture is the same in broad outline but different in detail. You don't get an empty land waiting to be filled. You get local hunter-gatherers already there, with their own traditions, their own knowledge of where the salmon run and where the flint outcrops lie. And into that world small groups arrive who know how to sow seeds, pen animals, and build more permanent houses. Genetically, those incoming farmers carry a distinct signature. In broad strokes, their ancestry clusters with the early Neolithic populations of the Balkans and Central Europe, themselves descended largely from the first agriculturalists of Anatolia. Compared to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Iberia, they look different on the genetic map. Less of the Western European hunter profile, more of what researchers simply call early European farmer ancestry. But these are big brush strokes. On the ground, it likely felt less like two separate species meeting, and more like neighbouring bands with different toolkits and different habits trying to figure each other out. Over time, the records suggest they did more than just eye one another across invisible cultural fences. Skeletons from early Neolithic sites in Iberia show mixed ancestry, part local hunter-gatherer, part early farmer. That implies intermarriage, or at least the regular exchange of children and partners between groups. Some hunter-gatherer individuals end up buried with the trappings of a farming lifestyle. Some farming communities show a higher share of local ancestry than their neighbours, as if they had folded more of the indigenous population into their villages. The spread of agriculture, in other words, was not a pure wave of replacement. It looks more like a series of overlapping ripples. In some valleys, the farming ripple pushes in strongly. Hunter-gatherer ancestry becomes a minority within a few centuries. In other areas, especially along coasts rich in marine resources or in rugged uplands, hunter-gatherer communities hold out longer, adopt some farming techniques later, or blend them more selectively into their existing seasonal rounds. Material culture tells the same story of mixture and gradual change. In the Mesolithic, people in Iberia were still mostly mobile. They used light, portable toolkits built around small stone blades and points, adapted to a life of moving between camps with the seasons. Sites hug river mouths, estuaries, and lake shores, places that offer fish, shellfish, birds, and access to inland hunting grounds. With the Neolithic, new things appear in the record. You start to see more substantial settlements, clusters of houses, sometimes with stone foundations, sometimes with post-built walls and floors that have been renewed again and again. Storage pits cut into the ground hold grain, or at least the carbonized traces of it. Animal bones shift from a dominance of wild red deer and boar to a higher proportion of domesticated sheep, goats, and cattle. Pottery arrives and blossoms into regional traditions. bowls, jars, and cooking pots show up at sites where previously there had been only stone and bone. Some are plain, others carry simple incised or impressed decorations. For archaeologists, these ceramic styles become markers of interaction and identity, spreading along certain corridors but not others. Food economies transform. Instead of relying entirely on the daily uncertainties of hunting and gathering, communities can now hedge their bets with stored cereal, milk from animals they keep, and herds that can be moved if local pastures fail. That doesn't mean the old ways vanish. Many Neolithic sites in Iberia show continued use of wild resources alongside domesticated ones. Deer are still being hunted, fish are still being caught. The new and the old are layered together. When we narrow the focus to the northern edge of Iberia, to the ranges and river valleys that will someday be called Basque country and Navarre, the geography itself seems to choreograph how this Neolithic dance plays out. The Western Pyrenees and the Cantabrian ranges are not an open plain. They're a folded landscape of steep ridges, deep gorges, upland pastures, and narrow coastal strips. Within a few kilometres you can go from sea level to high meadows, from oak forest to beach to bare rock. This compresses different microclimates into a small area, just as it did in the Ice Age. For farming communities trying to move through this terrain, progress would have been uneven. The big river corridors, the Ebro to the south, the Adour and the Gard to the north, act like highways, carrying pottery styles, livestock and seeds inland. But once those flows hit the transverse valleys and ridges of the Western Pyrenees, they fragment. One valley might be reached early, worked into the regional farming network, and show clear early Neolithic villages. The next valley over, separated by a high pass and a dense forest, might see little change for generations, its inhabitants still mostly foraging, perhaps trading occasionally for a polished axe or a pot. This patchwork is visible in the archaeological record. Some sites in and around the Basque region show early and relatively intensive Neolithic activity. Others, only a short distance away, look delayed, or show prolonged Mesolithic traditions persisting alongside the new farmers. The mountains do not simply keep people out, they slow them, channel them, and encourage local variation. If you imagine communities here, you can picture some groups embracing elements of the farming package quickly, maybe because good valley bottoms offer fertile soil and accessible pasture, while others, perched higher up or closer to rich coasts, continue to lean heavily on hunting, fishing and gathering, adding a few domesticated animals or crops only when it suits them. For the long story of Basque, this matters. It hints that the transformation from an entirely foraging world to a mixed farming landscape did not sweep uniformly through the Western Pyrenees. It filtered in along certain lines, met resistance or indifference in others, and produced a mosaic of lifestyles and ancestries. That mosaic will become even more complicated later, when new migrations cross Europe from the north and east, bringing steppe-derived ancestries and Indo-European languages. But before we climb that next rung of the ladder, we need to pause over something that lets us see these ancient mixtures more clearly than tools or pots alone. The DNA of the people who lived and died in Neolithic and post-Neolithic Iberia, and the patterns it preserves of who met whom and where. When researchers talk about ancient DNA, it can sound almost magical. You take a skeleton from 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, run it through a machine, and out pops a pie chart of ancestries, complete with neat labels and migration arrows. The truth is slower, fussier, and more fragile, but also in many ways more interesting. Most ancient DNA in Europe comes from bones and teeth, and among those from a very particular part, the dense bone of the inner ear and the roots of the teeth. Inside those tiny structures, protected from most of the outside world, a few fragments of genetic material sometimes survive, not whole, not pristine, but broken up into millions of tiny pieces. In the lab, those fragments are coaxed out with chemicals, captured and copied. At every step there is a constant enemy: contamination. Modern human DNA is everywhere, on the soil that touched the bones, on the gloves of the excavator, on the air of the lab. The DNA of the living is abundant and fresh. The DNA of the dead is rare and damaged. Left to themselves, the modern sequences would swamp the ancient ones. So ancient DNA labs are built to be a little like clean rooms. Researchers wear suits, masks, and hair covers. They treat surfaces and tools with bleach and ultraviolet light. They take samples from the interior of bones that have been carefully drilled open, trying to avoid any surface that might have been handled. They also sequence blanks, control samples that should have no DNA, to see what, if anything, is creeping into their procedures. Even with all of that, no dataset is perfect. Ancient DNA is often incomplete. Only a fraction of the genome might be recovered, and that fraction might be biased towards certain regions. Individual skeletons can give a blurry picture. It's only when dozens, then hundreds of individuals are analysed that patterns begin to stand out from the noise. This is why genetic results are described in terms of probabilities. A paper might say that a person is mostly Western hunter-gatherer with some early farmer ancestry, or that a population has around 30% steppe-related input. Those numbers are not read off a label inside the bones. They are estimates, based on statistical models that try to fit the observed genetic data to different combinations of ancestries. In Europe, 3 of those combinations come up again and again. Researchers often talk about Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, early European farmer ancestry, and steppe-related ancestry. Western hunter-gatherer is the shorthand for the genetic profile, common among the foraging populations that lived across much of Western and Central Europe after the Ice Age, before farming arrived. When scientists compare Mesolithic individuals from Iberia, France, and Central Europe, they see a family resemblance in their DNA. Not identical, not uniform, but similar enough that the pattern clusters together. Early European farmer ancestry is the label for the genetic signal that traces back to the first agriculturalists coming into Europe from Anatolia and the Balkans. Neolithic skeletons from Greece, the Balkans, and Central Europe share another statistical pattern. Again, not a single people, but a cloud of related groups with a broadly similar origin in the first farming communities of the Near East. Steppe-related ancestry refers to a third component that becomes visible later, starting in the 3rd millennium BCE. Individuals associated with the Yamnaya and related pastoralist groups north of the Black and Caspian Seas show a distinct genetic signature, a mix of Eastern European hunter-gatherer-like and Caucasus-related ancestries. When that mix appears in later populations across Europe, researchers infer some degree of descent, however indirect, from those steppe populations. It's tempting to turn these components into characters in a story. To imagine 3 pure peoples, hunters, farmers, and steppe riders, marching across the map, each replacing or mixing with the others. But the components are not people. They are statistical patterns in the data, simplified models that help us talk about very complex histories. No one in the past woke up and thought of themselves as 52% early farmer and 48% hunter-gatherer. They lived in villages and camps, spoke local languages, and belonged to families and clans. Their genetic makeup was the outcome of many generations of marriages, adoptions, alliances, and movements. When a paper says that a Neolithic Iberian has, for example, 70% early farmer ancestry and 30% local hunter-gatherer ancestry, that doesn't mean their grandparents were exactly one farmer and one hunter-gatherer. It means that, when you compare their genome to those reference groups, you can best explain what you see, as a blend of those two broad patterns with those approximate weights. Different modelling choices can shift the percentages around the edges, but the broad strokes, more farmer here, more hunter-gatherer there, tend to be robust. One of the most powerful ways to use this information is through what geneticists call time transects. Instead of looking at a single cemetery or a single moment, researchers sample individuals from the same region across many centuries or millennia. Early Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, later Mesolithic people, early Neolithic farmers, Middle Neolithic villagers, Copper Age burials, Bronze Age tombs, Iron Age graves. Placed in chronological order, their genetic profiles form a kind of film strip. You can watch the proportions of hunter-gatherer, early farmer and steppe-related ancestry shift over time. At some points the changes are gradual, suggesting local mixture and slow diffusion. At other points they are sudden, as if a new group with a different profile has arrived in force. In Iberia, these transects show the early hunter-gatherer base, the arrival and spread of early farmer ancestry, and later, a more limited but still visible arrival of steppe-related ancestry compared to some other parts of Europe. In the regions that will later be associated with Basque speakers, similar transects let us ask, did the same waves pass through here? Did they look different? Were there delays or bottlenecks? Where do the curves bend, and where do they flatten? What they cannot do is read words or grammar out of bones. Genes can tell us about biological ancestry, about who had children with whom, about movements of people and the scale of those movements. They can show that, in a certain period, individuals with a mostly steppe-related genetic profile begin to appear in a region where they were absent before. They can show that, in another area, local hunter-gatherer ancestry persists at higher levels than elsewhere, but they cannot directly tell us what language those people spoke. The association between genetic components and linguistic families, like linking steppe-related ancestry with Indo-European languages, is always an inference based on timing, geography, and correlations with the archaeological record. In some cases, those inferences are strong and widely accepted. In others, they are more tentative. For the Basque case, this means we have to keep two tracks in mind. On one track, genetics can show us that the ancestors of present-day Basque speakers went through the same broad continental processes as their neighbours, a deep hunter-gatherer past, the arrival of early farmers, some later steppe-related input. It can also highlight places where their genetic history seems a little different in degree or timing. On the other track, language belongs to culture. Euskara could have persisted through shifts in ancestry, or it could have spread without large numbers of people moving. The DNA alone cannot say. As we move into the story of steppe expansions and the changing face of Europe, it will be helpful to remember this double vision. The genetic record can trace the flows of people into and through Iberia. The linguistic record, much thinner and more fragile, will have to be inferred from other kinds of evidence. The mystery of Basque lies partly in the space between the two. When we talk about steppe expansions, it can sound like a single army riding out of the grasslands, thundering westward, sweeping all before it. The evidence points to something slower and more layered. In the centuries around 3000 BCE, groups living north of the Black and Caspian seas had settled into a way of life that leaned heavily on herding. Cattle, sheep, horses, wagons that could carry goods and families across long distances, camps and grave mounds scattered across open grasslands. Their genetic profile, that steppe-related signal we talked about earlier, shows up first in those regions. Then, over the next many centuries, that same signal begins to appear farther west and southwest, in places that had previously been dominated by early farmer and local hunter-gatherer ancestries. In Central and Northern Europe, the change in some areas is sudden and dramatic. Time transects there show Neolithic farmers with little or no steppe-related ancestry, followed by Copper and early Bronze Age individuals whose genomes are heavily, sometimes majority steppe-related. In some cemeteries, the shift seems to happen almost between one generation and the next. Archaeologists associate many of those later burials with what are called corded ware and related cultures, people who buried their dead with particular kinds of pottery, battle axes, and sometimes under small mounds. People whose graves often show new sets of objects and practices compared to the earlier Neolithic layers beneath them. It's tempting to treat this as a simple replacement. Steppe people arrive, Neolithic farmers vanish. But the closer we look, the more complicated it becomes. In many regions, there are signs of mixture and continuity. Some local lineages persist. Some farming practices carry on. Individuals who look genetically steppe-heavy are buried with objects that blend older and newer traditions. The story is not one of pure newcomers wiping out pure locals, but of new groups, new social networks, and new ways of life interacting with what was already there. Linguists and archaeologists often connect these movements with the spread of Indo-European languages, the vast family that would later include Celtic, Italic, Germanic, Slavic, Indo-Iranian, and many others. The timing fits. The early distributions fit. In regions where steppe-related ancestry becomes dominant, we later find Indo-European languages. But connect does not mean prove. There is no genetic marker for a verb ending, no bone that encodes a case system. The leading models suggest that some branches of Indo-European likely spread with steppe-derived groups and their descendants, especially in northern and central Europe, but there is no single mechanism that works everywhere. In some areas, language might have spread with large-scale migration and demographic dominance. In others, it could have moved along trade routes, adopted by local elites who found advantage in aligning with steppe-derived networks. In still others, it might have crept in family by family, through intermarriage and shifting prestige, without massive movements of people. What seems clear is that the steppe-connected groups had some powerful advantages in certain environments. Their economies were highly mobile. Herds turned grass into meat, milk, hides, and traction power. Wagons, and eventually more intensive horse use made it easier to move across open lands, to relocate when conditions changed or when new opportunities opened. Their social world seemed to have been wide. Grave goods and isotopic studies suggest long-distance contacts, movements of individuals across large areas, and patterns of exogamy, marrying partners from other communities. These kinds of networks can spread not just genes, but stories, songs, and languages. Conflict almost certainly played a role in some regions. Skeletal remains from certain periods show more trauma. Fortified settlements appear in places that hadn't needed walls before. It would be strange if all interactions were peaceful, yet warfare alone doesn't explain the patterns either. In many areas, steppe-derived ancestry grows over centuries, suggesting ongoing exchange, not just a single invasion. The result of all this, the mobility, the pastoral economies, the social networks, the periodic violence, was a genetic and cultural reshaping of much of Europe during the Bronze Age. In Central and Northern Europe, the steppe-related component becomes very strong. Later populations there can carry a large fraction of their ancestry traceable, in models to Yamnaya-like sources. In the British Isles, ancient DNA shows a striking turnover after around 2400 BCE, with steppe-derived ancestry rising sharply, and earlier Neolithic farmer lineages fading. In southern Europe, the picture is less uniform. Greece and the Balkans show steppe-related input, but woven into already complex local histories. Italy sees arrivals from the north and from the east at different times. The percentages vary, and so do the archaeological contexts. Iberia, sitting at the far southwest, shows yet another pattern, Here too, around the later 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, individuals begin to appear with clear steppe-related ancestry. In some regions, especially in the interior and certain river corridors, the signal becomes quite strong within a few centuries. In others, especially in some coastal or mountainous zones, the increase is more muted. The genetic turnover in Iberia is real, but it is patchier than in, say, Britain or parts of Central Europe. Even within Iberia, there are differences from valley to valley, from plateau to coast. Some lineages vanish, others persist. Local hunter-gatherer and early farmer ancestry does not disappear. It is folded into new combinations. Over time, the whole peninsula moves into a new genetic equilibrium that includes a steppe-related component, but the proportions are far from identical everywhere. This unevenness matters for language. If, as many researchers think, at least some Indo-European branches spread alongside these steppe-connected populations, then the Bronze Age was not just a time of shifting genes and economies. It was also a time when new speech communities were forming, breaking apart, and spreading. On the open plains of Central Europe, new dialects might have ridden with herds and wagons, carried by groups whose genetic profiles shifted quickly towards steppe-heavy. Along mountain ranges or in isolated coastal pockets, local languages may have held on longer, even as people married into wider networks and picked up new technologies. And this brings us to the puzzle that will haunt the rest of our story. If steppe influence, genetic and probably linguistic, is so widespread across Europe, if Indo-European languages come to dominate from Ireland to India, then why, in one corner of the Western Pyrenees, does a non-Indo-European language, Euskara, survive? The genetic record tells us that the ancestors of Basque speakers were not sealed off. They show the same broad layers as their neighbours: deep hunter-gatherer roots, early farmer ancestry, and some steppe-related input arriving in the Bronze Age. They were part of the same continental processes. And yet the language they speak today is not Indo-European. It does not obviously descend from Latin or Celtiberian, or any other known Indo-European branch. It stands alone, a language isolate, in a landscape that has been Indo-European speaking for millennia. Somewhere between the flows of genes and the flows of words, something different happened here. Was it geography, social structure, patterns of marriage and movement, the timing and intensity of steppe-related arrivals, or some combination of all of these layered over by later histories of empire and resistance? To get closer to an answer, we have to zoom back into Iberia itself, into the Bronze Age upheavals that reworked its societies, and into the specific ways those changes played out in the lands that would one day be called Basque country. When geneticists talk about Iberia in the Bronze Age, they sometimes use phrases that sound almost geological: turnover, restructuring, replacement. Underneath those dry words is a story that, as far as the data now suggest, was genuinely dramatic in many parts of the peninsula. If you line up ancient genomes from Iberia in time order, starting with early farmers and their Copper Age descendants, you see a long period where most people's ancestries look broadly similar. There are local differences, of course. More hunter-gatherer ancestry in some valleys, more Anatolian farmer ancestry in others, but the overall profile feels like variations on a theme. Then, in the later 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, the tune shifts. In many interior regions, especially on the Meseta, the central plateau, and along certain river systems like the Ebro and the Tagus, individuals appear whose genetic signatures are heavily steppe-related. Within a few hundred years, those profiles go from rare to common in some sampled communities. Earlier Y chromosome lineages, the paternal side, diminish or disappear from the record. New ones, associated with steppe-derived populations farther north, become dominant. This is one of the clearest cases in Western Europe where ancient DNA suggests a large-scale demographic change during the Bronze Age. Not just a trickle of outsiders, but a substantial reshaping of who was having children with whom. At the same time, it is not a simple story of new people in, old people out. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lines, often shows more continuity. Early farmer and local hunter-gatherer ancestry persists in the autosomal genome, the overall mix you inherit from all your ancestors, even where step-related Y chromosome lineages become common. In some datasets, this has been interpreted as a pattern where incoming groups of males, or male lineages, integrated with local communities that included many women with deeper Iberian roots. It is important to treat this carefully. Some studies do find evidence that looks consistent with sex-biased processes in certain times and places, a stronger replacement on the paternal side than on the maternal side. But this does not mean the exact same dynamic occurred everywhere in Iberia, or that we can straightforwardly translate DNA into a detailed narrative of conquest or violence. Different regions and even different micro-regions show different patterns. Sampling is still uneven, and social processes that produce sex-biased gene flow can range from brutal scenarios to more gradual, structured integration through marriage, alliance, and mobility. So, rather than a single Iberian script, it may be more accurate to imagine a patchwork of local stories, all unfolding under the broad umbrella of Bronze Age change. On the open interior plains, where herding and wheeled transport had obvious advantages, step-heavy profiles become common more quickly. Archaeological horizons there show new burial practices, new metalwork traditions, and hints of emerging social hierarchies. Large cemeteries with weapon-rich male graves appear in some areas. Hordes of metal objects, standardized forms of axes, swords, and ornaments, and the first clearer signs of elites controlling access to copper, tin, and trade routes suggest a world in which power was concentrating. Some scholars argue that these changes are tied to groups bearing more steppe-related ancestry, and, possibly, Indo-European languages. But again, tied does not mean mechanically caused. The rise of more hierarchical structures in Iberia could draw on local trajectories already underway in the Copper Age: fortified hilltops, control of mining districts, long-distance exchange of prestige goods. The newcomers, or newly dominant lineages, may have plugged themselves into these developing systems, amplifying some trends and dampening others, rather than inventing everything from scratch. Along the coasts, the picture becomes even more layered. The Mediterranean shore, especially the southeast and east, was already a busy corridor by the late 3rd millennium BCE. Maritime contacts linked Iberia with other parts of the western Mediterranean. Pottery styles, decorative motifs, and certain burial customs hinted exchanges with societies facing Italy and North Africa. Here, steppe-related ancestry appears too, but in more modest proportions in many sampled individuals. Mixed profiles become the norm: older farmer ancestry, local hunter-gatherer strands, and steppe-derived components blended together. Archaeological cultures in these zones do not all show the same sharp break that some interior communities do. Instead, certain elements shift while others continue. House forms, food traditions, and some ritual practices carry on across the supposed divide. On the Atlantic facade, including parts of Portugal and the northwest, another rhythm is playing. Monument traditions such as megalithic tombs linger longer here than in many inland zones. Atlantic trade routes start to matter more, carrying metal, amber, and ideas up and down the ocean's edge. Steppe-related ancestry does reach these areas, but often folded into a genetic background that retains relatively high fractions of early farmer and hunter-gatherer components. In some Atlantic contexts, the Bronze Age feels less like a sudden replacement, and more like a gradual reweaving of an already complex tapestry. Mountains add yet another layer of complexity. Highland zones often respond differently to big continental shifts. Valleys are narrow, Good farmland is limited. Movement can be difficult, especially for heavy wagons. Communities there can be both connected and insulated, linked to lowland networks through passes and seasonal migrations, yet also capable of maintaining local traditions for long periods. In several mountainous parts of Iberia, ancient DNA so far suggests a slower and less complete uptake of steppe-related ancestry during the Bronze Age. Local lineages persist longer. The overall genetic mix shifts, but not as abruptly, and not to the same proportions as on the Central Plains. Archaeologically, these regions may show fewer of the classic markers of rising Bronze Age stratification. Fewer monumental elite graves, more continuity in settlement locations, a stronger sense of local material traditions enduring while selectively adopting new tools and ornaments that circulate through trade. This does not mean the mountains were timeless refuges untouched by change. It does, however, suggest that the same winds that blew hard across the Meseta arrived as gentler, more variable breezes in some upland areas. All of this is happening against a backdrop of wider Mediterranean and European developments. Metallurgy is becoming more sophisticated. Tin and copper sources are being mapped, controlled, and fought over. Networks stretching from the Baltic to the Near East, from the Atlantic to the Aegean, begin to knit together into something like a Bronze Age world system. Ideas, gods, myths, and perhaps whole languages travel with ingots and blades as much as with herds and wagons. In Iberia, certain cultural labels appear in the archaeology of this time, traditions sometimes grouped under names like the El Aga culture in the southeast, or the Atlantic bronze complexes in the west and north. These are not peoples in the genetic sense, but recurring constellations of practices, house forms, pottery styles, burial customs, metalwork, that suggest shared norms over broad areas. Some of these archaeological horizons coincide in time and space with regions where steppe-related ancestry is particularly strong. Others overlay older genetic backgrounds with relatively little new input. The mapping between pots, people, and languages is not tidy. What seems likely is that the Bronze Age in Iberia brought expanding hierarchies, widening economic networks, and new opportunities and pressures for communities to align themselves with powerful centres. In some places, integrating into those systems may have involved adopting the speech, names, and customs of incoming or newly ascendant lineages. In others, local groups might have participated economically while holding on to older ways of talking, worshipping, and organising kinship. Somewhere within this varied landscape, on the slopes and valleys of the Western Pyrenees and their surrounding lowlands, the ancestors of later Basque speakers were living through the same centuries of upheaval. They were not outside history. The DNA says they too experienced Bronze Age change. They too carry traces of steppe-related ancestry layered onto older farmer and hunter-gatherer foundations. But the balance of forces looks a little different there. The timing and intensity of genetic shifts, the nature of local hierarchies, and the ways mountain and coastal worlds interlocked may all have shaped the outcome. To see how, we need to zoom in again, this time not on Iberia as a whole, but on the regions where, thousands of years later, Euskara would still be spoken, and on what recent studies suggest about the ancestry of the people who kept that language alive. When geneticists look specifically at ancient and modern DNA from the Basque country and its surroundings, a few patterns keep turning up. One of the clearest is this. Across the last few thousand years, people in many Basque-speaking regions show a strong thread of continuity with the kinds of ancestry profiles present there in the late Bronze and Iron Age. In other words, if you take individuals from Iron Age cemeteries in and around the Western Pyrenees, and then you compare them to present-day Basque genomes, the match is often closer than between those same ancient people and many of their modern neighbours. You still see the same big ingredients that appeared elsewhere in Iberia. Hunter-gatherer ancestry that reaches back into the Mesolithic. farmer ancestry whose deeper roots lie in Anatolia and the Near East, steppe-related ancestry that entered Western Europe in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The recipe is familiar. What stands out is not a missing ingredient, but the proportions and the stability. Many Basque populations today carry less steppe-related ancestry on average than populations in parts of central and northern Iberia. And when you follow ancient DNA through time in the Basque region, from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age and beyond, the picture so far looks more like gentle adjustments than repeated sweeping overhauls. This is where the word continuity really matters, and also where it can quietly mislead. Continuity in this context does not mean an unbroken line back to Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who somehow watched everyone else change while they stayed exactly the same. It does not mean a frozen, untouched population hiding in the mountains while the rest of Europe shuffled genes and languages like playing cards. What it means, much more modestly, is that if you compare genetic snapshots across time, the changes in Basque-speaking areas often appear smaller and less abrupt than in some surrounding lowlands. The ancestry blend that crystallized there in the late Bronze and Iron Age seems to have persisted, with additions and internal reshufflings, but without the same intensity of later large-scale shifts that show up elsewhere. That quieter profile likely has more than one cause. Geography is an obvious candidate. The Western Pyrenees and their associated ranges are not impassable walls, but they are not open plains either. Movement tends to funnel through specific passes, valleys, and coastal corridors. Herds can be driven over high pastures. People can and did travel long distances. Yet mass movements of wagon-using pastoralists or marching armies are naturally channeled and slowed in rugged terrain. In such landscapes, newcomers might settle in particular lowland pockets or along strategic routes, while upland and side valley communities maintain a higher share of older ancestry for longer. Gene flow becomes lumpy, arriving in pulses, thinning out with distance from major corridors, and sometimes failing to fully homogenize the population. But geography alone is never the whole story. Social factors matter too. Over time, communities develop marriage rules, inheritance customs, and ideas about who counts as us and who does not. They form dense networks of kinship and obligation that can either welcome outsiders in under certain terms or limit integration to specific roles and lineages. Some genetic studies of Basque populations, especially from more rural or historically isolated valleys, suggest lower effective gene flow with neighbouring groups during certain periods. That doesn't imply a total seal against contact. Trade, seasonal work and occasional intermarriage clearly happened and left traces. It does hint, though, at a pattern where most partners came from within a culturally defined circle, and where large waves of outside ancestry had a harder time fully replacing existing lineages. Against this backdrop of broad continuity, particular genetic traits have sometimes attracted outsized attention. Older literature, and a fair amount of popular writing, like to point to things like certain blood group frequencies, or the distribution of particular HLA types, or later, the presence or absence of specific Y chromosome haplogroups, as if any one of these could unlock the essential secret of Basque origins. One famous example was the relatively high frequency of the Rh-negative blood type in some Basque communities. For a while, this was woven into elaborate stories about ancient refugees and unique ancestry, tales in which a single medical marker became proof of extraordinary antiquity. Modern population genetics has been a bit of a cold bath for that style of thinking. Single markers, whether blood groups, individual mutations, or even named Y chromosome lineages, are terrible storytellers on their own. They can drift in small populations, they can be pushed up or down in frequency by selection, for reasons unrelated to ancestry in the deep past. They can ride along with demographic quirks that have nothing to do with language history. When you zoom out to the full genome, which averages over thousands of such quirks, a more grounded picture emerges. Basque populations do show distinctive patterns. They cluster together in genetic analyses. They tend to sit slightly apart from many neighbouring Iberian groups, and even from some nearby French populations, in ways that line up reasonably well with the historical and linguistic boundary of Euskara. They also sit close, very close, to ancient individuals from the Iron Age and Late Bronze Age in the same broad region, not on a different planet, not in a separate branch of humanity, but in a relatively tight cluster whose centre of gravity seems to have moved less than in some other parts of Western Europe. The cautious takeaway from all of this is both simple and stubbornly unsatisfying for anyone looking for a single dramatic origin myth. Yes, Basque genetic distinctiveness is real in the statistical sense. It reflects a particular history of ancestry mixing and relative continuity since the late prehistoric period. The mountains, valleys, and coastlines of the Western Pyrenees helped shape that history. So did social practices that, at various times, seem to have limited large-scale influx from outside. No, this distinctiveness does not prove that Basques are direct, unchanged descendants of Paleolithic hunters, or of the very first farmers, or of some named pre-Indo-European people imagined as a single ancient tribe. It doesn't let us point to one moment and say, here, on this date the Basques began, and they have been the same ever since. Instead, the genetic evidence suggests something softer and more continuous. In a corner of Western Europe that was always part of wider networks, but never entirely swept by them, a population formed whose roots reach back through the same great processes that shaped the rest of the continent. Ice Age refuges, the spread of farming, the arrival of steppe-derived groups, the rise of Bronze and Iron Age societies. Through all of that, the people of this region changed, mixed, and adapted like everyone else. They just seem to have done so under conditions that preserved more of a particular local blend and perhaps more of a particular local way of talking. To understand how that way of talking, Euskara, threaded its path through Roman armies, medieval kingdoms and modern nation-states, we need to look not just at genes but at the landscape of contact, the passes, ports and valleys where languages meet and sometimes, quietly, endure. If you trace a finger along a map of the Western Pyrenees, it doesn't feel like a wall. It feels like a tangle. Ridges run one way, then bend. Valleys cut across them, some open and gentle, others narrow and steep. There are coastal plains where rivers finally slow down, high pastures that only make sense in summer, and a web of passes that are obvious when you know them and almost invisible when you do not. In this kind of landscape, the idea of mountain barrier is only half true. In winter, when snow closes higher routes and storms roll in from the Atlantic, even a modest ridge can turn into a serious obstacle. Travel narrows to a few safer paths, often following river valleys or hugging the coast. Carts get stuck. Herds have to pick their way carefully. Messages that might cross a plain in days can take much longer, or fail to arrive at all. In summer, the same terrain changes character. The high passes open. Shepherds drive flocks up to mountain pastures. Traders and pilgrims may choose the shorter but steeper paths, cutting straight across divides that seemed impassable in colder months. Suddenly the barrier acts more like a filter or a gate, letting some kinds of movement through and slowing others. Over centuries, this seasonal breathing of the landscape shapes how people meet, marry, and speak. One way to imagine it is to think in terms of micro-regions, not just the Basque country as a solid block, but a patchwork of valleys, upland plateaus, and coastal strips, each with its own patterns of connection. In a narrow valley with limited good farmland, most families might know each other by name over many generations. Marriages could follow a familiar logic. This hamlet tends to marry into that one. This side of the ridge rarely marries across to the other. Even when the broader world changes, New kingdoms, new religions, new trading partners, those marriage circuits can keep turning quietly along the same grooves. Anthropologists sometimes talk about endogamy, marrying within a group. That can sound rigid or exclusionary, but on the ground it often looks more like practical habit than strict law. Your cousins and neighbours share your work rhythms, your inheritance customs, your expectations around land and dowry. Bringing in a spouse from a distant valley is possible, but it takes extra negotiation. Doing it the local way takes less. Multiply that by dozens of valleys and hilltop communities, each with overlapping but not identical patterns, and you begin to see why gene flow and language flow might move in lumpy, uneven ways. At the same time, people don't only live inside their valley, they live along its edges. Metal ores are rarely found exactly where grain grows best. Salt springs bubble up in some places and not in others. Rich fishing grounds lie off certain stretches of coast. From very early in prehistory, these facts pushed people into exchange. In the wider region, copper and later bronze moved from mountain sources toward lowland consumers. Iron did too. Salt, essential for preserving food, especially fish and meat, travelled along well-worn tracks from inland deposits to coastal markets. Dried or salted fish moved the other way, inland toward communities that might never see the sea. Most of the individuals involved in these trades did not abandon their homes. A family might send one son as a muleteer, one season at a time. A village might specialize in producing a particular object, or in hosting seasonal fairs. Ideas, fashions, and a few marriage partners moved along these routes even when the bulk of the population stayed put. This kind of networked life makes it possible to imagine a region where contact is constant, but deep mixing is patchy. People can be keenly aware of Romans, or later of Visigoths, Franks, Castilians, or Gascons. They can trade with them, hire on as soldiers or sailors, share tools and techniques, adopt saints' cults or legal forms, and still come home to a village where everyday conversations, courtship and child-raising happen in a local tongue. Here we reach an idea that linguists sometimes call cultural buffering. A language does not survive for millennia because its speakers never meet anyone else. It survives because, even when they do, it keeps a firm grip on key domains of life. In many mountain and frontier regions of Europe, bilingualism has been the norm for a long time. A person might use one language at home and in the fields, another in markets, courts, and churches. Children grow up hearing both, but the emotional weight, the intimate jokes, the arguments and lullabies belong mostly to one. Over time, communities can turn this into an unwritten rule. Public matters may be handled in the prestigious or administratively dominant language, but family, neighbourly obligations and local decision-making stay in the old one. Local institutions, village councils, customary law, neighbourhood festivals, cofradias and guilds can reinforce this simply by doing their work in the vernacular. When that vernacular is also tied to very fine-grained senses of place, our side of the ridge, our grazing rights in that valley, our lineage house. The result is a strong buffer against replacement, even under steady external pressure. Geography does not dictate this outcome. There are plenty of mountain regions in Europe where local languages gave way to newcomers, sometimes quite rapidly. Political power, economic incentives, schooling, and sheer demographic weight can all tilt the balance. But the Western Pyrenees offer a plausible combination. A physically complex landscape that channels movement into certain routes, a social fabric woven out of tight valley communities and long-distance trade ties, and a set of cultural habits that, at various times, seem to have favoured keeping Euskara at the core of local identity while layering other languages on top for wider dealings. In that sense, the mountains and valleys do not explain Basque survival on their own. They shape the stage on which people make choices. whom to marry, how to inherit land, what language to use in a village meeting, which tongue to teach a child first. Across the Roman period, the Middle Ages, and into the early modern era, those choices would be tested again and again as new roads, new armies, and new faiths crossed the old routes. To see how Euskara threaded its way through that, we turn to one of the great engines of change in Western Europe, Roman power and the smooth stone roads that tried to flatten every landscape they entered. When Roman power finally rolled into Iberia, it did not arrive as a single moment. It came in waves, first as punitive expeditions against Carthage's old allies, then as longer campaigns against stubborn upland peoples, then as a slow knitting together of coasts, river valleys, and passes into something the Romans thought of as a single space, a province. From the Roman point of view, Iberia was not one thing. It was a puzzle of peoples and landscapes, Celtiberians in the interior, Turdetani and Tartessians in the south, Cantabrians and Asturias in the north, Vascones somewhere in the tangle of the Ebro Valley and the western Pyrenees, each with their own ways of fighting, farming and speaking. Conquest in this world was not just about battles. It was about changing the routes. Roman roads did not ignore the old tracks. They followed them, straightened them, hardened them, and then multiplied them. A path that might once have been a muddy seasonal trail became a paved route usable in most weather, with milestones, posting stations and inns at regular intervals. Along these stone lines, people, goods and information began to move with a rhythm that would have seemed uncanny to earlier generations. If you lived in a small farming community near one of these roads, Romanization did not happen in a single day. It seeped in through certain doors. One of the first was the army. For local young men, enlistment offered pay, a share in booty, and eventually citizenship. To serve, you needed to at least understand the language of commands. Latin phrases shouted on parade grounds and battlefields became part of everyday speech, even for those who would never speak it at home. Another door was administration. The Romans loved records. Taxes, land surveys, legal disputes, municipal charters, all of it written, all of it in Latin. A local notable who wanted influence in the new system might send a son to learn letters in a town school, or hire a scribe who could navigate the paperwork. Over time, this created a class of bilingual intermediaries. They spoke the local language with their neighbours and relatives, but they negotiated with officials, read edicts and drafted petitions in Latin. Cities were where these worlds touched most intensely. Roman policy encouraged the growth of urban centres, colonies for veterans, municipia for allied communities, and new planned towns laid out in familiar grids. In these spaces, Latin was more than just useful. It was a badge of belonging to Rome's wider world. Shop signs, contracts, dedications to the emperor, graffiti on walls, all carried Latin letters. Public speeches, market regulations, religious processions tied to the imperial cult, Latin again. Even if a good deal of quiet conversation in back alleys or kitchens happened in older languages, the public soundscape tilted toward Rome. Trade followed suit. Merchants who moved wine, oil, salt fish, iron and textiles along the Roman roads learned enough Latin to bargain in distant markets. Units of weight and currency, terms of credit, shipping agreements. These were more easily handled in the administrative language that linked provinces from Lusitania to Syria. Prestige played its part. Over generations, Latin became the language of upward movement. To rise in city councils, to gain favour with governors, to join the imperial bureaucracy, to read fashionable literature or write polished funerary inscriptions, you needed it. Schooling amplified this. Even modest town schools trained boys, and more rarely girls, to read aloud, copy model texts, recite speeches. The alphabet, once an exotic import, became a familiar tool. With it came a mental world of Roman myths, lore, and moral examples. This doesn't mean Latin swept everything else away at once. Linguistic replacement under Rome was uneven, and it followed lines that are still faintly visible. In the lowlands and river plains where cities and villas clustered, the shift could be rapid. A child born into a family that had moved to a Roman town might grow up thinking of Latin as normal, and their grandparents' speech as a rustic accent, or as something half understood. In the uplands and the more broken country along the Pyrenees, the pattern looks different. Here, urban centres were fewer and smaller. Large estates existed, but didn't completely displace older forms of landholding. Seasonal movement between high pastures and lower valleys continued. The local institutions that organised grazing, irrigation, and communal work kept functioning, often with minimal need for written records. In such settings, Latin could arrive as a thin layer. You might hear it from a tax collector once a year, from a passing unit of soldiers, from a trader at a seasonal fair. You might pick up loan words for tools, ranks, legal concepts, and sprinkle them into your own speech. But your prayers at home, your quarrels over boundaries, your bedtime stories for children stayed in the old language. Names are one of the clues that something like this was happening around early Basque speakers. Across parts of what is now Navarre, Aragon, and even into the Ebro Valley, Roman-era inscriptions preserve personal names and place names that look, to modern linguists, like they belong to a family of languages related to Euskara, or at least to a broader Aquitanian type. Some tombstones show an interesting mix, a Roman-style first name coupled with what seems to be a local family name, or a Latinized version of something non-Indo-European. A man might be Marcus, son of a father whose name does not fit comfortably into Celtic or Latin patterns. Place names, too, whisper hints. Certain endings and sound patterns scattered across a wider area than the modern Basque speaking zone suggest that languages of this type once stretched further south and east, before retreating or being overlaid by Latin and later Romance. In the Aquitanian region north of the Pyrenees, inscriptions show divine names and personal names that connect quite neatly with later Basque vocabulary. This has led many scholars to see a continuum of related speech communities running on both sides of the Western Pyrenees in the Roman period, even if they were never politically unified. If that picture is roughly right, then the Roman centuries become a story not of sudden isolation but of a slow squeeze. Imagine a map where Latin is thickest in the major valleys, coastal cities and administrative centres, and thinner as you move into more marginal or higher ground. Over time, those thick zones expand, joining up like spreading ink blots. Towns grow, veterans settle, rural elites adopt Latin to signal status, and local Romance dialects begin to form. In the pockets between these spreading zones, in certain valleys, on some slopes, in communities whose economic life does not depend heavily on towns, older speech persists. People there still interact with Latin speakers. They go to markets, serve in auxiliary units, occasionally move to cities. But when they return, the core of daily life is dense enough and inward-looking enough that the language of home remains dominant. From outside, this might have looked like conservatism. From inside, it may not have felt like a choice at all. You simply talk to parents, neighbours, and village assemblies in the tongue everyone shared most deeply, and treated Latin as something useful at the edges, in courts, tax offices, and army camps. Over generations, this steady outward growth of Latin and its descendants narrowed the territory of Basque-related speech. Areas that had once used these languages shifted first to spoken Latin, then to early Romance. Place names fossilized older words, family names kept faint echoes, but the living language retreated. In the Western Pyrenees, though, the retreat was incomplete. There, geography, social habits, and perhaps a certain pattern of Roman presence combined to keep Euskara in that inner ring of life. the family, the village, the customary council, even as Latin became the language of empire all around it. When the empire itself began to crack and new powers moved into the vacuum, that long habit of layering one language for public affairs and another for local ones would matter a great deal. Because after Rome, Latin did not disappear. It changed masks. And Euskara, still breathing in its valleys and hills, had to face a new round of pressures from kingdoms who claimed Roman inheritance even as they spoke in newly formed Romance tongues. When imperial administration finally flickered out, there was no single day when people in the Western Pyrenees woke up and realized Rome was gone. What they saw instead were uniforms and banners changing. Some of the soldiers now called themselves Goths. Their kings issued laws in Latin, stamped seals with imperial imagery, and spoke about themselves as heirs of Rome, not its destroyers. In councils, bishops still quoted Roman law, still wrote to one another in the same careful Latin that had filled imperial archives. To the north, across the mountains, Franks were doing something similar. Their chiefs converted to Christianity, adopted Roman titles, and let bishops and notaries go on recording land grants and disputes with the same vocabulary they had used under emperors. On the ground, the lines of power shifted, but the tools of written rule did not. This is where it becomes important to separate two things that often get blurred together: political change above and language change below. When a new dynasty takes over a kingdom, it can change taxation, military obligations, and religious policy relatively quickly. All of that can be handled by a fairly small circle of officials, priests, and landowners. They may be bilingual or even trilingual, moving between the formal Latin of documents, a spoken early Romance, and whatever local speech their tenants use. For everyone else, daily life moves more slowly. The crops do not care whether the king is Roman or Visigoth. Paths to pastures and springs follow the same gradients. The neighbours with whom you share irrigation ditches, grazing rules, and marriage alliances are still the same people. Language at that level is not a decree. It is a habit woven into every interaction. How you scold a child, how you bargain over a cow, how you comfort someone in grief. Changing that is not like swapping a banner. It is more like slowly replanting an entire forest, tree by tree. So, in the 5th and 6th centuries, as Visigothic kings settled into Toledo and Frankish rulers anchored themselves around Paris, the Western Pyrenees slipped into a new world that was, in some ways, very familiar. Latin remained the language of law codes and ecclesiastical councils. Bishops wrote to one another about heresies, land disputes, and royal succession in phrases that would have been legible to late Roman officials. Early medieval kings were proud of this continuity. It gave them legitimacy. But what people actually spoke to one another in farmyards, workshops, and mountain passes was more diverse than ever. In the broad plains and larger towns, spoken Latin had been evolving for centuries into what we now call Romance, a family of dialects that would eventually give rise to Spanish, Gascon, French, and many others. Those shifts were not planned. They crept in through sound changes, new vocabulary, and grammatical shortcuts that spread among ordinary speakers. In upland pockets, older languages persisted. Around the Western Pyrenees, that likely meant various local Romance dialects in some valleys and along main routes, and Euskara, or something very close to it, in others. Into this patchwork stepped one of the most important institutional players of the early Middle Ages, the church monastery. Monasteries, and the bishoprics linked to them, became key sites where speech and writing met. Monks, priests, and notaries copied Latin texts, composed charters, and recorded donations of land, mills, vineyards, and villages. They listed boundaries with painstaking care, from this rock to that stream, from this oak to that hill. Those boundary lists are where older languages sometimes surface, like stones under shallow water. Even when the overall document is composed in Latin, the specific names of fields, streams, and hamlets often appear in whatever local language people actually used when they pointed at those places. In regions around the Basque-speaking zone, in parts of Navarre, in what is now the French Basque country, in neighbouring valleys, early medieval charters preserve names that look strikingly Basque in form. Personal names, too, begin to show up that way. A donor may be identified with a Christian name framed in Latin, but his father or grandfather's name, when written down, sits more comfortably alongside later Basque vocabulary than with purely Romance or Germanic patterns. These are not full sentences in Euskara. The written record remains overwhelmingly Latin. But the presence of recognisably Basque elements in these texts suggests that scribes were reaching for sounds they heard in surrounding communities and trying to trap them in Latin letters. From this, historians and linguists have cautiously drawn a picture of the early medieval Western Pyrenees as a world of overlapping identities. If you lived there around the 8th or 9th century, how you thought about yourself depended on context. You might be, first and foremost, a member of a particular village, tied by kinship and custom to a handful of neighbouring hamlets. Your we could mean the people who share your irrigation channel, your grazing rights, your small stone church. At the same time, you were also part of a Christian community. The liturgy you heard, even if half understood, was in Latin. Saints' names, feast days, and moral stories reached you through homilies that filtered written Latin tradition into the local spoken tongue. Whatever that tongue happened to be, you belonged too to a wider political structure, though it might feel distant. Perhaps your valley fell under a Visigothic king in Toledo, then, later, under a Frankish or Navarrese ruler, or formed part of the gradually crystallizing kingdom of Pamplona. Oaths of loyalty, military levies, and tribute connected you to that level, but only intermittently. Your language fit into this stack of identities, but not always neatly. You could attend mass conducted in Latin, swear allegiance to a lord whose court spoke an early Romance, and yet use Euskara at home as your primary means of communication. None of these had to cancel the others. They occupied different layers of life. In that sense, Euskara did not need to compete directly with Latin as a written language, or even with Romance as a prestige spoken one, in order to survive. It needed to remain indispensable in the spaces that mattered most day to day. In a tightly knit village where every neighbour understood Basque, there was little incentive to switch to something else when discussing crops, marriages, local disputes, or village bylaws. The more inward-facing those conversations were, the more Euskara could retain its grip. Latin and Romance could still seep in at the edges. Loanwords for new tools, legal concepts, or religious ideas slipped into Basque speech, just as Basque place names and personal names slipped into Latin texts. The result was not a wall between languages, but a mesh. Multilingual surroundings do not automatically erase a language that continues to do important work in a particular social niche. They can even stabilise it, as speakers become adept at moving between tongues for different purposes. In the Western Pyrenees, Euskara's niche seems to have been precisely that local, customary world, unwritten agreements about land use, seasonal movements, inheritance practices, and neighbourhood solidarity. As long as those spheres remained relatively autonomous, the language that carried them could persist. When medieval kings extended their reach, they often did so by recognising and codifying existing customs rather than trying to replace them outright. Charters might confirm village rights, as they have always held them, without specifying the language in which those customs were expressed. That left room for Euskara to continue doing what it had been doing for centuries, binding communities together in speech, while other languages handled the distant realms of law, theology, and royal administration. Over time, of course, pressures would mount. Frontier wars, shifting allegiances, and the gradual thickening of romance in nearby towns and markets all tugged at Basque-speaking communities. But the basic pattern, Latin and then Romance at the level of written power, Euskara in the intimate, practical layers of life, proved surprisingly resilient. It set the stage for later centuries, when questions of peoplehood and territory would sharpen, and when the language of the valleys would begin to be talked about, not just spoken, as a marker of something distinct. Before that could happen, however, another layer had to be added: stories. Stories about origins, about who we are and where we came from. And like all powerful stories, some of them would drift far from what the evidence can actually support. Once people start telling origin stories, it does not take long before someone tries to turn them into proof. Basques were no exception. In fact, for several centuries, they became a favourite canvas for other people's ideas about race, nation, and purity. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when European scholars were very busy sorting humanity into imagined hierarchies, the Basques attracted special attention. Their language was not Indo-European. Their skull measurements, when taken by those obsessed with such things, did not seem to fit neatly into existing categories, and their mountain homeland looked from a distance like a natural fortress. For some writers, especially in France and Spain, this made the Basques into a kind of living museum piece. Supposedly untouched by history, they were described as the oldest Europeans, a direct line back to Paleolithic hunters, preserved in a Pyrenean time capsule while the rest of the continent changed around them. Other, more sinister voices took the same ingredients and mixed them differently. In the early 20th century, racial theorists in several countries tried to enlist Basques in their schemes. Some imagined them as the purest representatives of a supposed Western race. Others, especially under authoritarian regimes, flirted with the idea that Basques could be a model of racial homogeneity and ancestral rootedness. A few Basque nationalists facing discrimination and struggling to articulate a sense of peoplehood sometimes reached for these tools as well, adopting the language of blood and antiquity that was circulating around them. If outsiders insisted they were a separate, original race, it could be tempting to accept that label and turn it into a source of pride. The difficulty is that all of these narratives rest on assumptions that do not survive contact with what we can actually test. Modern genetics does not show any European population as pure, in the 19th century sense of a group descended unchanged from a single ancient stock. It shows, instead, centuries upon centuries of mixing, bottlenecks, migrations and local isolation layered on top of one another. Basque-speaking populations fit into that picture like everyone else. They do have some distinctive features. Compared with many neighbouring groups, they show higher levels of ancestry linked to earlier Neolithic farmers and pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherers, and somewhat lower levels of the steppe-related ancestry that spread with Indo-European languages in much of Europe. They also share certain patterns of genetic variation that suggest long-term continuity in the Western Pyrenees. But distinctive is not the same thing as separate species or untouched or superior. The Basque genetic profile we see today is the result of the same processes that shaped other populations: repeated waves of movement, different degrees of contact and isolation, survival through epidemics and famines, and the demographic jolts of war and political change. If you could roll time backward through the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, and the Late Ice Age, you would not find a line of people standing in a neat row waiting to become the Basques. You would find local groups intermarrying with neighbours, absorbing newcomers, losing some lineages to chance, and keeping others by accident as much as by design. That is why using genetics to support old ideas of racial superiority or special destiny does not work. DNA can tell us about relatedness, about proportions of ancestry that trace back to certain broad groups, and about the timing of population events like expansions and bottlenecks. It cannot rank the worth of cultures, justify territorial claims, or decide who belongs to a modern community. Even within the more limited scientific uses of these data, there are easy traps to fall into. One common mistake is to equate language with DNA. Because Euskara is unusual, and because Basque speakers have some genetic particularities, it is easy to slide into saying things like, Basques are genetically non-Indo-European, as if Indo-European were a biological category. But Indo-European is a language family, not a gene category. Many modern Spanish or French speakers who carry lots of steppe-related ancestry could, in principle, learn Basque and raise their children in it. Many Basque speakers, historically, must have had ancestors who spoke pre-Indo-European languages, but also others who spoke Latin, Celtic, or early Romance at some point in their family trees. Language shifts all the time without wholesale population replacement. People adopt new ways of speaking for trade, for prestige, for marriage, or because it is the language of schooling and administration. Genes move through these linguistic borders more slowly, but they move too. Another mistake is to treat modern groups as if they were fossils. When a study points out that Basques retain more of a particular ancient ancestry than some neighbours, it is tempting to declare them the last Paleolithic Europeans or unchanged Neolithic farmers. The problem is that modern Basques are not frozen snapshots from the Stone Age. They are the descendants of people who have lived through Roman conquest, medieval state formation, plagues, economic shifts, and all the quiet, everyday churn of births, deaths, and marriages. Saying that they have a stronger trace of an ancient component than other groups is not the same as saying they are identical to that component. A third pitfall is cherry-picking specific markers. For a while, one blood group, the rhesus negative factor, was seized upon as special evidence of Basque uniqueness. Its relatively high frequency in some Basque regions led to imaginative speculations about separate origins, even non-human ancestry in the wilder corners of popular writing. In reality, blood groups are just one small part of the genome. Their frequencies can drift, especially in populations that have gone through bottlenecks or long periods of relative isolation. Picking one marker and building a sweeping story on it is like finding a single unusual word in a book and deciding the entire language must be unrelated to its neighbours. A better frame is quieter, but more faithful to what the evidence allows. Basque distinctiveness seems to be a story of continuity plus mixture, shaped by geography and history. There is continuity in the sense that people in the Western Pyrenees appear, over the long run, to have kept more ancestry from certain earlier layers of European settlement than many surrounding populations. There is mixture because those same people also show signs of contacts, especially in the Bronze and Iron Ages, with wider currents moving across the continent. There is continuity in the language, which probably descends from speech traditions that predate the arrival of Indo-European tongues in Iberia. There is mixture in the vocabulary, phonology and structure of Euskara, which bear the marks of long contact with Latin, Romance and other neighbours. Rather than a sealed time capsule, what we see is a highland region where new currents were filtered, slowed, and partially absorbed but rarely absent. When we recenter the mystery this way, it becomes less about a supposedly pure people preserved from change, and more about the survival of a language isolate in a landscape that has seen layer after layer of cultural and demographic transformation. The question is not, how did the Basques avoid history, but how did a non-Indo-European language remain essential in certain communities, while empires rose and fell around them, and while genes and goods flowed through their valleys? That question does not lend itself easily to grand nationalist slogans or racial hierarchies. It points instead to local decision-making, marriage patterns, the prestige of neighbouring tongues, the role of the church and the state, and the stubborn usefulness of speaking the same language as your closest neighbours. It is a story still being pieced together from bones, pollen, inscriptions, loan words, and genetic variants, and one that becomes more interesting, not less, when we set aside the idea that it needs to prove anyone's purity. The Basque mystery in that sense is not a key to an ancient race. It is a window into how languages and populations can thread their way through the same storms, leaving traces that overlap, diverge, and only partly line up. From here, the puzzle shifts again. If the people changed and the genes mixed, but the language held on, what does that say about how languages live or die? And what does it mean to carry a language like Euskara into a world where the pressures are very different from those of the Roman frontier or the medieval monastery? If you zoom all the way out past the slogans and the myths, several threads seem to hold. One is regional continuity. Across multiple ancient DNA studies, people living in and around the Western Pyrenees tend to look like a local branch of a wider Iberian story, rather than a sudden arrival from somewhere else. Deep hunter-gatherer ancestry, early farmer ancestry, and later steppe-related ancestry all show up, but in proportions that shift more gently than in some surrounding regions. Another thread is later reduced gene flow. By the Bronze and Iron Ages, when steppe-related ancestry and Indo-European languages were spreading dramatically across much of Europe, the Basque country seems to have been more of a slow filter than an open highway. New genetic components do appear, and there are clear signs of contact and mixture, but the pace and volume look lower than in, say, parts of the Meseta or the Atlantic facade. You can think of it as a landscape where every wave that passed through left something behind, but none of them washed everything away. The third thread is the persistent language ecology. Euskara does not survive in a vacuum. It survives in a particular environment of valleys and ridges, coastal inlets and high pastures, market towns and parish networks. For long stretches of history, the practical value of speaking Basque to your neighbours and the slower, more partial pressure of outside languages created a balance where the old tongue could persist. Regional continuity, partial isolation, and a language that remained useful at the village and valley scale. Those are the quiet, well-supported pieces of the puzzle. But around them the questions crowd in. One of the biggest is linguistic. Does Euskara have deeper relatives? At the moment it stands as a language isolate, attempts to link it conclusively to anything. The old Aquitanian language attested north of the Pyrenees, distant Caucasian families, even long-vanished tongues from Anatolia or beyond, have not produced a consensus. The Aquitanian connection is the closest, but that may represent a very local branch of the same pre-Roman speech zone rather than a bridge to some larger family. If there were once related languages stretching across parts of Western Europe, their written traces have either not been found, not been recognized, or were never produced in the first place. Another open question is timing. We can say that by the time Roman authors were writing about the region, some communities were clearly using non-Indo-European names and terms that look Basque-like. We can say that later medieval documents show Euskara firmly rooted in certain valleys and towns, while Latin and Romance were consolidating as languages of power. What we cannot yet pinpoint is exactly when and how the language boundaries shifted. When did Indo-European speaking communities first appear in neighbouring areas? At what point did certain valleys tip from majority non-Indo-European speech to majority Celtiberian or Latin, and then to Romance? How far north and west did Basque-related varieties extend before retreating? The archaeological and genetic records give us broad patterns of movement, but the fine-grained map of language change is still blurry. Then there are the regional dynamics of the Bronze and Iron Ages. We know that across Iberia, These were centuries of new metalworking, new trade routes, new social hierarchies. We know that some areas saw large-scale movements of people carrying more steppe-related ancestry, while others appear to have shifted languages with less obvious genetic upheaval. In the Basque country and its surroundings, the picture is particularly knotty. How much of the Indo-European presence here was filtered through small-scale elite networks, how much through actual settlement, and how much through slow bilingualism at the margins? Did some local groups adopt Indo-European languages and later shift back? Did others hold to pre-Indo-European speech while their genetic profile changed through marriage and trade? These are not questions the current data can answer cleanly. Somewhere in the middle of all this uncertainty, it might be a good moment to mention something more solid. If you enjoy drifting off to stories like this, there is a Sleepy Time History book available at sleepytimehistory.com with a discount running this week. It gathers several episodes into a form you can read slowly or fall asleep over without needing an internet connection. If that sounds comforting, you might like to take a look. Back in the valleys of the Pyrenees, the scientists are busy. New ancient DNA projects are targeting exactly the kinds of places that used to be blank on our maps. Highland cemeteries, small hilltop sites, and long-used burial caves tucked away in tributary valleys. Each new genome from one of these places can refine our picture of who lived there, where their closest relatives were, and how their ancestry changed over time. With enough samples spread carefully across both space and time, patterns might sharpen, perhaps clear signs of a Bronze Age influx into one valley but not the next, or evidence that Iron Age elites in a particular town were more genetically mixed than the rural communities around them. On the linguistic side, better dated inscriptions could shift the timeline. An earlier than expected Basque-like name in one region, or a securely dated inscription showing an Indo-European language holding on longer than we thought in another, would force us to redraw our mental maps of who was saying what and when. Comparative linguistics, too, is moving slowly forward. More detailed reconstructions of early Celtic, Italic, and other neighbouring families can refine which elements of Euskara are likely to be old, and which are probably the result of contact. Subtle patterns of borrowed words may end up telling us more about the direction and intensity of interactions than any individual inscription. In the background, refined demographic models are quietly knitting these strands together. By combining genetic data, radiocarbon dates, archaeological context, and what we know about historical settlement patterns, researchers can test different scenarios. For example, whether the relative scarcity of steppe-related ancestry in Basque-speaking areas reflects one big missed migration wave, or many small decisions over centuries that limited marriage with certain groups. None of this is guaranteed to produce a neat answer. It is entirely possible that the Basque mystery will remain, in some sense, unresolved. Not because the evidence is hiding, but because the processes that shaped this region were complex, overlapping, and different in each valley and century. But that too has its own kind of calm appeal. Instead of a single dramatic revelation, the Basques are X and came from Y, we end up with a landscape of stories. Hunter-gatherers adapting to new farmers, Bronze Age traders moving along the coast, shepherds carrying songs and words from valley to valley, monks copying Latin texts while preaching in Basque to their parishioners. In that landscape, Euskara is not a fossil from a lost world, and Basque DNA is not a secret code. They are simply the traces left by countless lives lived in one corner of Europe, under changing skies. Some puzzles remain, and likely always will. Somewhere in the folds of those mountains there were conversations no one recorded, choices no one wrote down, and boundaries that shifted in ways we will never fully reconstruct. Lying here, imagining them, we stand at the edge of what we can know, and then just beyond it, in the quiet space where history shades into possibility. So where does that leave us, here at the edge of an old Europe? not with a legend of untouched purity, not with a simple tale of the first Europeans, standing unchanged while history raged around them. Instead, with something quieter and, in its way, more interesting. A language that probably carries echoes of speech from before Indo-European arrived, yet has spent 2,000 years in conversation with Latin, Romance, and everything that followed. A population that shows signs of deep regional continuity, yet also clear traces of farmers from the Near East, herders carrying steppe-related ancestry, Romans, medieval neighbours, and modern mobility. A landscape that shaped who could marry whom, who traded where, and which words were worth learning, without ever completely shutting the door to the wider world. Basques in this picture are not a people outside of history. They are a people very much inside it. The mystery is not how they avoided change, but how so many layers of change still left something distinctive behind. As you drift towards sleep, you might let that thought settle. Every language alive today has taken a long, uneven path through time. Each one is a kind of living time capsule, but not like a sealed box buried in the ground. More like an old river, fed by many streams, carrying sediments from distant hills, still flowing in more or less the same course, even as every drop of water is new. Euskara is one of those rivers, so is whatever language you are listening in right now. Inside its sounds and structures, there are faint fingerprints of forgotten neighbours, ancient trade routes, old conquests and quiet resistances. Loanwords that arrived with grain, with metal, with religion, with tax systems, with school teachers. Grammar patterns that may go back to communities no one remembers by name. When we listen closely to a language, we are never just hearing the present. We are overhearing generations of contact, compromise and creativity. We are listening to choices made around hearths and in market squares, whispered on mountain paths and shouted in busy ports. If you've enjoyed following this trail through pre-Indo-European Europe, ancient DNA, and the tangled story of the Basque country, you might like to keep wandering. You can gently tap like or subscribe so that when the next journey appears, it finds its way back to you. And if you feel awake enough, you're warmly invited to leave a comment, telling us where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there as this reaches you. Some of you will be in the Basque country itself, some on other coasts once touched by early farmers and steppe herders, some in cities far from any of these places but still carrying, in your own ancestry and language, traces of the same deep stories. If you'd like something to read slowly offline, there's also a sleepy time history book that gathers prehistoric secrets and other quiet journeys into one place. You can find out more, and if you wish, buy a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, you can let the timelines blur and soften. Imagine Europe before its familiar names, forests thick on the uplands, rivers running cold and clear to the Atlantic, small groups of people moving along ridges and shorelines, carrying words that will someday leave only the faintest residue in place names and family names. Later, imagine the first Indo-European languages arriving. New sounds, new gods, new ways of reckoning kinship. Not sweeping everything away in an instant, but mingling, coexisting, edging into one valley while another holds back for a while longer. Then imagine the Romans, the medieval kingdoms, the merchants, the railways, the motorways. Through all of it, people walking home at dusk speaking whatever tongue feels most like home to them. In some corners, that tongue is still Euskara. Languages, like genes, remember more than any one person can. They carry hints of ancient bottlenecks, forgotten crossings, and long-ago neighbours. But they are also being remade, all the time, in every conversation, including this one. As you lie there, you're part of that ongoing story. Your own words, your own accent, your own mix of languages are tiny, living evidence of how history and geography have met in you. The maps and the models can only take us so far. Beyond them, there is this quieter knowledge, that every voice is a strand of deep time brought into the present. Let your thoughts loosen their grip on dates and details. Let the names, Neanderthals, farmers, herders, Basques, Romans, drift to the back of your mind like distant towns seen from a night train. Somewhere out there, in the dark folds of the Pyrenees, people are sleeping under the same stars that watched hunter-gatherers, first farmers, and Bronze Age traders. Somewhere else you're listening, in your own time and place. Between those points stretches a long, winding history we will never fully chart, and that is perfectly all right. For tonight, it is enough to know that languages endure, change, and carry echoes of worlds long gone, and from this quiet edge of an old Europe,